that was very well done. Very well done. For a variety of reasons, apart from the fact that he was born 600 years before she was, it is clear that William Shakespeare never met Sylvia Mousy. So that's bad. Otherwise, he could never have written that ridiculous line saying, "Frailty, thy name is woman." From the first time Maureen and I met Sylvia and Ken in the early 1950s, pause a minute, just remember, history goes back that far, when they lived just below the old Grouse Mountain chairlift, not far from the hippies of the day, who lived among the trees and did their washing in Mosquito Creek. One of them is here today, to my delight. I will say only that he came from Switzerland originally. But the minute we saw him, I was struck by her boundless energy and enthusiasm, which coincides extremely well with what you heard from Yvonne. It seemed that energy and enthusiasm to last almost forever. She'd go anywhere, do anything, try anything, no matter how much effort or wear or tear. They made the journey, as you just heard, out to BC quite an expedition rather than take the easiest way, as most of us would. I remember periods when we seldom saw them at weekends. They both hated driving then, yet their idea of a weekend was to hop into their ancient Austin A40 with its long resident mouse under the back seat beneath the kids, drive to the Rockies, camp overnight, then drive all the way back next day. And as you heard again, they took the kids camping in all sorts of wilderness places to show them what the real world was all about. And though it's fair to say they never got as rich as, say, Donald Trump, with heavy backpacks and endless curiosity, she and Ken explored and hiked many far corners of the world that most people haven't seen even in these days of easier travel. And you saw a few examples of that earlier on. They seemed somehow reluctant to stay still for long or really settle down. So I was astonished when Sylvia telephoned us one day in 1970 and said, in a voice full of exclamation marks, "We've just bought a waterfront property on Galliano Island." After I'd asked her where the hell that was, and she told me, I said, "But you don't have enough money to buy waterfront property." Her reply, and as I remember the unbelievable figure, if I remember it rightly, was we put $100 down and we have to come up with another 100 within a month. Just think about that compared with today's prices. Then she went on with a sentence that is probably now part of Galliano folklore. "And we'll raise it, even if I have to sell my body." Sylvia convinced us this way that she found heaven and said there was a lot like it next door. Maureen and I went over in the pouring rain a few days later and bought 2 clifftop acres virtually in Paulian Pass that kept us filling the ferry coffers for more than 30 years. And that was before they began to charge real money. It was before either of us had put up a building that Maureen and I had our first taste of Sylvia's Galliano cooking. We had walked the 5 kilometers of gravel to their lot. It was dusk, wet and windy, and I recall Sylvia more like a whirling dervish than a chef tossing things into a pot on an open fire. I don't recall what it was we ate standing around the fire, but I do remember it was delicious, which won't surprise any of you here today. The first building right on the clifftop was, they told us, to be casually described as a shelter if anybody came around looking for permits. They lived there a lot of the time while the 2 former buildings went up. Then as Cameron was reaching possible early retirement age, there was a collective brainstorm, quite a mad one, really. Why not open a restaurant out there in the wilds of a small, long, and almost empty island? 21 kilometers from the ferry, and far away then from anything but a handful of homes. Nowhere near a supply store to get all that fresh stuff a good restaurant would need. I always took it for granted it was Sylvia's idea to do this, but never raised the question. And the picturing menus made her famous far and wide. It also soaked up a great deal of that energy and persistence. How do you get fresh fruit and vegetables up there as you need them? Grow your own, dig, 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 plant, 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 like both of them, particularly Ken. How about fresh fish? A local island fisherman regularly dumped a sackful at the door, and Sylvia usually had no idea at all what was in the sack when she got it. But no matter, there must be a tasty way to cook anything local fresh out of the water. And she always came up with one. It worked. The word got out and spread with the good reviews. I remember a Toronto celebrity booking the whole restaurant for a party to celebrate an important occasion in his life. Others here, as has been demonstrated already, can tell more stories about Sylvia, how she made so many friends, how she helped so many people in different ways, and with Ken, fashioned a future far different from anything they might have met in the northern England they left behind. But I will finish by saying only that when Sylvia left us, she also left behind a life well lived and much loved. And which of us could ask for anything more when it's time to go?
Had pillowy cheeks and who fell asleep in her lazy boy in front of the television. I already had that grandmother and I loved her just as much, but there were very few surprises with that grandmother. She was predictable. With Sylvia, you never knew what to expect. Sylvia was the unconventional grandmother. Sylvia was the grandmother who lived in the boonies and traveled the world, the grandmother who listened to mariachi music, favored costume jewelry, painted flowers on her clothes, and sent hand-painted watercolored birthday cards in the mail. Every Christmas, she would send a homemade Christmas cake that was so dense my dad would still be toasting it in April. And every Easter, my dad would be the lucky recipient of not one, but 2 homemade, hollow, dark chocolate Easter eggs filled with chocolate-covered ginger, each nestled in its own carefully hand-picked, second-hand floral print mug. These were, of course, intended for me and my brother, but no matter how many times my mom told her the kids don't like dark chocolate, every year we received the eggs in the mail because Sylvia liked dark chocolate. Luckily, my other grandma would also send an Easter present, a $2 bill and a white chocolate store-bought Easter bunny, which was what I preferred. Sylvia cooked inedible things like hot crust buns dubbed hot crossed pucks by my dad, and delectable delights like granny bars, her homemade version of an O. Henry. She made meringues for every occasion and passed on to me her love of crackling. She was definitely not your run-of-the-mill grandmother. As you are all aware, Ken and Sylvia were often on the road, backpacking in a different country, and whenever they were away, I anxiously awaited the gift that would no doubt be coming my way, a doll. For years, on every trip they took, my granny would choose a doll from whichever country they visited and present it to me upon their return. These dolls usually came with a name and some sort of description, a history or life story, sometimes written by the dolls themselves. Over the years, I amassed quite the collection. I had dolls from Bulgaria, Scotland, Mexico, Turkey, and Cuba, and they were the subjects of many elementary school show and tells. My doll from Cuba, a 3-foot handmade black cloth doll named Lulu, came with one scant outfit and a letter, written by Lulu, that explained that if I asked nicely, maybe my granny would sew her more clothes appropriate for Canadian weather as she was accustomed to the tropics. As a child, Granny and Granddad rarely missed one of my music recitals, of which there were many. At the time, I didn't even want my own parents to go, but looking back, I'm very grateful that they were there. When I was in grade 3, I discovered my love of writing, and my granny, without my knowledge, submitted a number of my poems to a CBC Young Writers Contest. I didn't win, but the fact that she thought that I could encouraged me. I never did thank her for supporting my many creative endeavors, so thank you, Granddad. In the summertime, my brother Quinn and I would often spend a week or two with Ken and Sylvia. Sometimes we would come here to Galliano and Granny would make fairy cakes with hundreds and thousands and have tea parties. She made us coddled eggs for breakfast, or grapefruit that she allowed us to put sugar on, something Yvonne would never let fly. And in the evenings, we would watch her two favorite television shows, The Simpsons and, shockingly, The Young and the Restless. Sylvia was a strong advocate of bubble baths, and some of my fondest memories are in the tub in the summer, making soap beards and playing with a sea sponge the size of my head. I would run my hand over the necklaces that hung in the bathroom and rummage through the top bathroom drawer that held her makeup and examine its contents. To this day, the smell of old lipstick still reminds me of my granny. The summers that we didn't go to Galliano, Quinn and I accompanied Ken and Sylvia camping. We would spend hours in the back seat of their hot 4Runner while Granny and Granddad yelled at each other over a map in the front. I think these car rides were probably the times that Quinn and I got along the best because we couldn't speak ourselves with all the arguing going on. Sylvia, as you know, loved to be the center of attention and I think considered herself somewhat of a comedienne. She was always cracking a joke, often at the expense of a loved one, usually my mother, but she was not lacking in the ability of laughing at herself. She loved to regale with stories where she was often the punchline. Sometimes her humor was a little off color, but she always amused, and she was often the one laughing the hardest. One Christmas, our whole family vacationed in Mexico, and while in a small aircraft low enough for a non-pressurized cabin, the door next to my mother, who was holding my 3-month-old brother at the time, flew open mid-flight. After we landed and the other passengers were vomiting on the tarmac, Granny said to an obviously distraught Yvonne, if he had fallen, the Mexicans would have thought Quinn was the baby Jesus. Another Christmas, 5 years ago, she said to me, I taught my children to walk early by carrying them upside down. A fact that was later confirmed by my mother. Though she may have been lacking in empathy, there was certainly no shortage of laughter when she was in a room, intentional or not. Intentional or not. And quite often, spending time with Ken and Sylvia was a comedy of errors, akin to an Elvis and Costello skit or a scene from Fawlty Towers. For example, here is an example of a typical conversation from 7 years ago. A typical dinner conversation, sorry. Ken, we need to figure out where we're going for dinner Saturday night. Where we're going for dinner? We're having dinner with someone, but I've forgotten who. Yvonne. What do you mean? Me. They're just so popular that they get their dinner plans mixed up, right, Granny? Ken. Last week we showed up for dinner at Anne's and we were a day early. Me. You need to get a calendar. Sylvia. No way, what for? Yvonne. Why is it that you have such an aversion to calendars? You can get such beautiful calendars. Ken. I know, we throw them out all the time. You mean people buy you calendars for gifts and you just throw them out? Well, no, not exactly. These ones are free. Well, that's not the same thing. You can get beautiful calendars and it's like having art hanging on your wall. And where would we hang it? I think it's the Yorks. I think we're having dinner with the Yorks. But we should be having them here for dinner. It's our turn. Maybe we are? If it isn't raining this afternoon, let's invite them over for a game of bocce and then hopefully they'll say, we'll see you tomorrow night for dinner. Yes, it must be the Yorks because last week she said, we need to have dinner with the Smiths and you and Ken as well. I remember that. Well, then we're not having dinner here because it's definitely the Smiths' turn to have us over for dinner. Yvonne, Dad, how's your ankle? As much as Sylvia loved telling stories about herself, I've always loved telling stories about her. Like the time a bat flew into their bedroom in the middle of the night, crawled under the covers and bit her on the hand. Or the time she dyed her hair the color winsome wheat. Really, the stories are endless. She was undeniably a source of entertainment. In addition to being the center of attention, Sylvia also loved to be doted on. She loved a luxurious lifestyle, but had no want for many material possessions. She had her coffee in bed, made by a bedside alarm clock coffee maker, whose equal I have yet to discover. And she employed the same skills of coercion used to persuade her mother to peel her grapes to convince Ken to paint her toenails for much of their 68-year marriage. Nobody could argue that Sylvia was not spoiled, but there is something to be said for wanting to live your life a certain way and sticking to your guns. She was definitely a woman who knew what she wanted. 5 years ago, we were told that my granny had 3 months to live. Subsisting on a diet largely comprised of hot chocolate, wine, and the odd boost and brandy, and after a long battle with Parkinson's, she managed to defy all odds and hold on to this fall. My granny was strong-willed and stubborn to the end. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she had the worst case of FOMO, or fear of missing out, I've ever known. Granny, thank you for everything. Thank you for your eccentricities and your wild ways, and thank you for being the funniest, funnest, wackiest, weirdest granny I could have asked for. I love you. I would like to finish off by reading something written by my brother Quinn, who couldn't be here today, as he is off in Australia. Where are we? I'm sure by this point, everyone has already regaled you with stories of mountaintop birthday parties, camping trips, plane rides gone awry, and dubiously mailed, ill-conceived but well-meaning seasonal treats. So I'll say this, Sylvia was one of the most fascinating, eccentric, hilarious, warmest, and unfathomably stubborn people I have ever met. She lived life by her own rules or bent the rules to suit her needs, and if I'm able to experience or accomplish even a quarter of what she did in my life, I'll consider myself to be doing very well. So grab a glass of wine or a meringue, or God forbid, a slice of fruitcake, and enjoy what I hope is a fitting final gathering.
First-hand research to talk about. It's an honor for me to be asked.
Could you use the mic there?
Can you hear me? It's for me a very distinct honor that Ken has asked me to read this. And it's nice to know that this time up I have had access to the very best research resources. And this is what Ken has written. It is my turn to say something, but I know how difficult it will be, so I'm asking someone else to speak for me. Sylvia was only 16 when we first met. Both of us were at the same art college evening class in Sheffield. Several times I had the feeling that someone was looking at me. It turned to be this pretty girl with the big eyes. As we left to leave, when I had my hand on the door handle, a little hand brushed against mine. Nothing came of this until a few weeks later, when I was waiting for the bus to take me out on a hiking trip. The only other passenger was this same girl. When I found out that she also was going hiking, I changed my destination. Before we eventually parted, we had made a date to meet again. From then on, my life was changed forever. Being with Sylvia became so full of pleasant surprises, excitement, joy, laughter, especially love. I remember she proposed to me when she was only 17. Until then, my plan was to emigrate to anywhere in the world that would have me. Sylvia thought this was a fantastic idea if we could go together. Eventually, I was accepted by Ontario, so plans were made for her to join me 2 or 3 months later. Unfortunately, she failed her medical exam and had to wait 6 months for another X-ray. She passed this, but was delayed again by having to wait for a passage by sea. We were married on July 29, 1948, in Etobicoke, Ontario. Our adventures started immediately. I bet. Within 2 weeks, we got a lightweight tent from England, found a farmer who would let us camp in his orchard, bought a car, a Morris 10, and set up camp beside Etobicoke Creek. From then on, our lives have been so full, it would take a book to describe them. No one, I'm sure, has had more happiness than we have had for 70 years. During this time, we shared every experience together, which made it twice as good. Sylvia loved people, especially her own family, who she hoped would be able to look back on their lives with as much satisfaction as she has had. Her smile, laughter, and happiness made her a joy to be with. I love her so much. In spite of the cruel illness she suffered during the last few years, I never heard her grumble, even though the frustration must have been hard to bear. To all the people who have helped Sylvia in all possible ways, I would like to give thanks. It would have made me happy to see all, sorry, the type's a little off here. It would have made her happy to see all the people here today. She will always be remembered. Ken.
My dad found this letter that my mom wrote, over 20 years ago, just about her life. So, and he wanted someone to read it, so I will. So, 63 today. I can hardly believe the years have passed, and while I'm still healthy and at the peak of my life, I'd like to give thanks for all that has made my life so full of happiness. For Ken, who is as near perfect for me as anyone could possibly be. For my sons and daughters, all different. What I wish for them is that they can look back at their lives when they are 60 plus with as much satisfaction. For all my friends who have listened when I needed them and laughed and cried with me. For the luck that led me to Canada. For the sense to make my home here. For all the lucky circumstances which led us to Galliano. And for all the good things of life right on our own land. Apples, pears, berries, mushrooms, and fish from the ocean. I am surrounded by beauty. There is no ugliness or sordidness in my life, only the memory of the pain my children have suffered. I had a new beginning. All my pain was in my childhood. In many ways, your own is easier to bear than that of those you love. I have been selfish and opinionated, and able to seize opportunities life has to offer. I love people and I love life in all its forms, for better or worse. That's me, Sylvia.